Origins of the Korean War. Learning to live as neighbors.
In the previous section, part 3, I talked about a revolution that took place in North Korea prior to the Korean War. For historians in South Korea or the United States, to describe this revolutionary change in North Korea from 1945 to 1950 in a positive light is politically fraught. But documentary evidence shows why American intelligence agencies portray the North Korean regime of that period as having broad popular support from people in the North. Land reform was carried out in early 1946. That land reform in 1946 confiscated land controlled by the Japanese colonial government and Japanese landlords, confiscated land from Korean landlords who owned more than 12 acres of land, and religious organizations, and distributed these lands to tenant farmers for free. Of the more than 700,000 households that received this land for free in the North, 63% of these 700,000 households had never owned land before. New labor laws also went into effect starting in 1946. Labor laws that mandated an 8-hour workday, shortening of dangerous work to 7 hours a day, a ban on child labor, so no child younger than 14 is allowed to work, gender equality in wages, and paid time off after childbirth. New laws on gender equality that went into effect in July 1946 legalized gender equality in terms of voting, wages, education, marriage and divorce, property ownership, and inheritance rights. There was a palpable sense of excitement for those who were being empowered, such as in this self-introduction by a young tenant farmer by the name of Seo Young-jun. This is a self-introduction that appears as a handwritten note in an application for membership in a certain organization that Suzy Kim had found in the archives. In this self-introduction, Seo Young-jun writes, "As a poor peasant family since before my grandparents, we lived as tenant farmers to Mr. Kim Un-bu in Seokwadong for 13 years. And then starting in 1925, as tenant farmers to Mr. Park Byung-up in Seokhodong. We were not only oppressed and exploited, but we also suffered bitterly. We not able to go to school, caring for my younger siblings until I was 12, and then in order to support my siblings, starting to farm at the age of 13, until liberation. When liberation came, we were allotted land. We gained land, and I was able to farm freely and live a life of freedom." He writes, 자유스러운 생활, a life of freedom. Before liberation, I couldn't even read. After liberation in 1946, I started attending Korean school until 1947. I learned to read and participate in organizational life and began a collective life. I joined the Youth League in May 1946, the Peasant League in February 1946, and then I took charge of physical education for the Youth League in our village, training the league members every morning and having fun with this work. And then I wanted to have an organizational life. I joined the Workers' Party in 1947, beginning my organizational life, taking charge of the party cell in January 1948, and carrying on cell life to this day. What does this tell us about people like Seo Young-jun? People like Seo Young-jun and their families have been tenant farmers for generations, going back even before their grandparents' time. When Korea was liberated, he couldn't even read the Korean alphabet. But in 1946, he took part in the land reform, and his family gained land. By 1948, he was in charge of the party cell, meaning that he had not only status, but also real power. Status and power that he could not have imagined having prior to this revolution. We don't know if Seo Young-jun was a kind man. We don't know if Seo Young-jun was wise, compassionate, and an able leader. But we do know that there were many like Seo Young-jun who seized the chance to turn Korean society upside down, or, depending on your point of view, right side up. In the South, the situation was very different. In the South, the United States Army military government and the nascent South Korean state was trying to stop a revolution. As in many other former colonies in Asia following the Asia-Pacific War, the political terrain was defined largely by the opposition between imperialism, colonialism on the one hand, and anti-colonial nationalism on the other. In this context, Christians and Christian institutions would take on an important role. Although Christians constituted less than 3% of the population in post-liberation Korea, in a situation where the South Korean state that was established in 1948 had weak popular support, Christians and Christian organizations, both inside Korea and overseas, these Christian organizations played a key role in providing rhetorical, institutional, and material support to establish South Korea as an anti-communist state. They played a key role in helping the American effort to displace that colonialism versus anti-colonialism opposition. They helped displace this colonialism versus anti-colonial opposition and replace it with totalitarianism versus freedom paradigm, especially in South Korea. In Korea, the origins of the conflict between Christians and communists go back to the colonial period. In left-wing journals like Gaebyeok, for example, or Bipan, Marxists in the 1920s, they denounced religion, especially Christianity, for supporting capitalism, imperialism, and for promoting an escapist life. We should also say that among Christians, and especially among Protestant Christians, there were theological and political differences, often along regional groupings. So, for example, in the Northwest region, that is to say, in the Pyongan and Hwanghae provinces, conservative Protestantism in that area would become a foundational axis of anti-communism in South Korea when those Christians come south. In comparison, Protestantism in the Northeast region So for example, Hamgyong province and eastern Manchuria, Protestants in that region were significantly less conservative. As for the Catholic Church, the political stance of the Catholic Church in the Vatican and in Korea was decidedly anti-communist. For example, Bishop Patrick Byrne, the Vatican's apostolic visitor to Seoul, Archbishop Spellman, the Archbishop of New York, and in Korea, Bishop Roginam, Bishop of the Seoul Diocese. They were influential in shaping not only the political orientation of the Catholic Church in post-liberation Korea, but also the policies of the United States Army military government in Korea. For Protestant missionaries, for example, Horace H. Underwood, for Protestant missionaries like Horace H. Underwood, his politics were liberal, perhaps even slightly left of liberal. In the 1920s, for example, Underwood helped establish 신생활, a socialist literary monthly. At Yeonhee Jeonmun, today Yonsei University, Underwood worked with intellectuals across the political spectrum, including Baek Nam-un, the Marxist historian I mentioned earlier. After liberation, Underwood worked with the United States Army military government. And he probably had some role in taking those polls that we saw earlier. In his tour of the southern provinces, for example, Underwood's 1945 assessment of the situation was that the most popular and active organizations were those associated with the People's Party of Korea, 조선인민당, that was led by Yoon Eun-young, the Christian socialist, leader of the Korean People's Republic, which Underwood characterized as primarily, but not uniformly, communistic. On the other hand, the so-called Democratic Party, 한국민주당, led by conservatives like Kim Song-soo, was poorly organized or unorganized in most places. Underwood concluded his November 1945 summary by stating that, quote, the military government cannot and should not discriminate against either the communists or the People's Republic as political parties, unquote. With many leaders and organizations boycotting the 1948 elections, conservatives were overwhelmingly elected to South Korea's National Assembly. That assembly elected Syngman Rhee as the first president of South Korea. This is how John J. Muccio, special representative of the American president to Korea, and later ambassador to South Korea, 1949 to 1950. This is how Muccio recalls the transfer of power to the new government that was formed. Quote, the government of Korea was inaugurated August 15th, 1948. The United States military government and all of its ramifications still intact. My immediate concern was the transfer of all the functions of military government to the new government set up by the Koreans under the direction of President Syngman Rhee. We transferred the police force, the whole police establishment, on the 11th of September 1948. And between that and December 12th, when we finally transferred the bank account to the new authorities, there was a constant transfer of responsibility from the United States Army military government to their new Korean counterparts. It was a very intricate process. What kind of government emerged from this process? Here is how Gregory Henderson, Vice Consul in Korea, U.S. Vice Consul in Korea, from 1948 to 1950. This is how Gregory Henderson put it. The police, that is to say, South Korea's national police, the police were very cruel. They descended where they would. They arrested frequently without warrants. The kind of justice that was dispensed relied very little on rules of evidence. It was not very just. People were tortured to produce statements for the prosecutors. Unquote. In December 1948, on the heels of the uprising in Jeju and a rebellion in the Yeosu Suncheon region, South Korea's first national security law was passed. With this law, with this national security law, in 1949 alone, over 118,000 people in the South were arrested. From September to October 1949, 132 political and social organizations were ordered to disband. And under the Syngman Rhee government from 1948 to 1960, just counting journalists, as many as 2,000 journalists were arrested in that 12-year period. With the Civil War underway by 1948, the conflict between communists and anti-communists set loose a cycle of violence and reprisals, followed by counter-violence and counter-reprisals. When trying to understand the origins of a civil war, focusing on who fired the first shot, for example, 6.25, June 25, 1950, focusing on who fired the first shot is a way to deflect attention away from the violence that accompanied the creation of South Korea as an anti-communist state. A line drawn across the 38th parallel in August 1945 and divided occupation of Korea by US and Soviet troops, and south of the 38th parallel with the United States military government keeping in place a traditional social order that the Japanese had maintained. These led to widening political and ideological cleavages in Korean society after the end of World War II. No one accepted the 38th parallel. Not on the left, not on the right. No one accepted the 38th parallel as a border that separates two Koreas. Thus, the stage was set for a war that saw mass killings by the police, the military, and by one's neighbors. Although the fighting stopped in 1953, there was no peace.